There's not a day that goes by that you turn on the TV and watch the news and see something about climate change. And the images that we see are getting progressively worse. We notice that there is increased flooding, that in fact the strength of the hurricanes that are affecting our planet is increasing, that our oceans are getting more and more acidic, and it's killing the wildlife. It's causing the Great Barrier Reef, parts of it, to die. Now, it's interesting that we've come to this place after 50 years of scientists, biologists warning us. Why is it that we are now, after 50 years of warning, you would think with such a long runway, we'd do something about it? What is it specifically about humanity that we didn't stop, pay attention, and fix this problem? This is what this TED Talk is going to try to explain. I am going to let you into the mind of the human being. We're all going to do it together. And I'm going to provide you with some answers. It's not enough to just say, we're typically human, we procrastinate, we don't take care of problems. I'm actually going to show you what neuroscience is indicating and why it is that we're here today. So, about 50 years ago, a biologist came out and tried to explain to humanity what was going to happen. It was very predictive. He saw the warning signs, and in his mind, he wanted to simplify the science so that the rest of us would understand. Now, he called this a tragedy, so I'm warning you, spoiler alert, all the sheep are going to die. But he called it the tragedy of the commons, and the story is very simple because he wanted to illustrate a principle that we've taken for granted for more than a century. The story goes like this. Imagine that you live in a village, and just outside the village, there's a grassy knoll. Beautiful grass is growing, and you imagine that you could own a couple of sheep, let them graze, collect the wool, sell the milk, and your financial condition will improve. So you do that. Of course, your neighbor now notices that you're improving in life, and they too go out and buy a couple of sheep and let them graze on the same piece of land. By the end of this tragedy, the entire village has done the same thing. But now the earth beneath the grass is tired, can no longer grow the grass to support all the sheep. So all the sheep die. The end. Now, the scientist who came up with this story was a fellow by the name of Garrett Harding, and he wrote this back in 1968. And it contains a few lessons. The first thing is, who did the land belong to, really? It was nobody's. Therefore, was it everybody's? The fact that we could just use this land causes some questions to be raised. Okay, what else? The fact that we as individuals were profiting from this land, and by the way, the use of the word individual could also mean companies, firms. The fact that we were able to profit without accounting for the use is also something that we need to question. Ultimately, what happens? If the individual is put before that of the good of the common, well, then the common purse has to pay for it at the end. And that's where we are now. Now, when Garrett Harding created this tragedy of the commons, he specifically forecasted that this was going to happen. It was predictive. And he made it very simple for the rest of us to understand because he said, think of all the resources on Earth. It's a finite supply of these resources. If we keep growing our population, at some point, the math won't add up. Very simple to understand. And with 50 years' notice, you'd think that today we wouldn't be facing a climate crisis. Now, compare that message with another environmentalist, Greta. What she says about the climate and about the condition of our Earth is pretty much the same as what Garrett was saying 50 years ago. But look at how she puts it. She says, I've stopped going to school because school prepares you for the future. And I don't think there is a future for my generation. Now, that message has one fundamental difference, and that is, it is in the present. It is an absolute red flag that it's happening right now, compared to Garrett Harding's message, which was, hey, it's coming. It's in the future. So, if Greta's sounding the same alarm, and we had 50 years, can we just walk away saying, well, it's all our fault? You know, humans, procrastination, it's part of our charm. What are you going to do about it? I know for a fact that when I give out assignments with a 2-week deadline, most students will not start right away. They're going to wait a couple of weeks, and the night before, everybody's pretty busy. Doesn't that explain why we're in this situation? Well, not quite. Here's why. Because those of us who study behavior want to know why is it exactly that we behave the way we do. And what makes us typically human is this thing called the brain that we all carry. Now, when we talk about the brain, we kind of think that it's this 3-pound gray jelly thing that we have between our ears. But in fact, the brain is broken down into 3 very distinct areas. Let me start by explaining the most important part for the human function, and that is something called the reptilian complex. Just like the name suggests, it's the oldest part of the brain, and what it does, it controls your body. You don't wake up in the morning and schedule breathing or swallowing your saliva. You just do it. If you don't swallow your saliva, you're going to drown in your own mouth. It's the kind of thing that you take for granted. You go outside, and it's cold, you shiver. It's an instinct for you to put on a coat. Therefore, the reptilian part of your brain is that which makes sure that you as a human have the best chance of survival. Okay, what's the next part? Now, this part of the real estate I really like because it controls memory and emotion. And those two go hand in hand. Think about you having a memory that was caused by a strong emotion. Not only does your brain remember it more, it's because the chemistry that goes along with your brain, all those chemicals that slush around our body, fuse it. So, when we have a memory, we can go back to it, and that helps us in our everyday decision making. Here's what I want to tell you about the limbic system. That is so underestimated as to how much our daily decision-making rests on what we remember, our memory. We're going to be doing a couple of experiments in a couple of minutes, and you're going to see just what I mean. The last part of the brain is the neocortex. Now, this is a relatively new piece that we've kind of, in evolutionary terms, it's only about 50,000 years that we have it. And what it does, think of it like the human simulator. It actually allows us to know that there's a future, that there is a time continuum. And when we're trying to figure out what to do in the future, then we can decide under uncertainty. That's what the neocortex does. So altogether, the brain assists us in making decisions, and don't forget, the limbic and reptilian parts of the brain are very quick. They have the habit of coming up and giving you support so that you could do your daily, routine without having to stop and think. But when you have a more complex problem, your neocortex jumps in. Okay, so here we are. Assuming we all have a brain that's ready to go, let's give it a little run, and we're going to start with our first experiment. Nobody gets hurt, your skull will not be opened. What we will do very simply is follow the instructions on the screen. So I'm just going to give you the instruction, and you try to do it, okay? We're going to be testing the reptilian part of the brain by not blinking. Stop blinking. Keep your eyes open. Don't blink. Hold on. Don't blink. You're all looking a lot like this guy. And some of you have already blinked because you thought about what you had for breakfast this morning. So what have we learned? How do you stop blinking? It's an override, right? It's like control, that you take over this hardwired thing that you do. You blink because otherwise your eyes dried out, and that's not a good thing. So can we override the reptilian part of our brain? Absolutely. Is it hard? Can we sustain it? Absolutely not. Okay, we learned something. The next part of the brain is the limbic area. And that I mentioned to you just before, that it's where the memories and the emotions live. Now let me give you two examples of how important memory and emotion are. We know that if we, well, how many of you have a cat here that got too close to a radiator or a stove, right? That happens once, because a cat has a limbic area as well. And the experience of getting burned gets fused into the cat's brain. They're never going to get that close again. Same thing with us. Now, what's interesting about the other part, or the other role of the limbic brain, is that it contains all our memories. Now, you underestimate just how much we rely on memory. If I ask you what is 2 plus 2, you don't sit there going, okay, I got this. You start with 2, then I put 2 more of whatever, and it's 4. You actually instantly say 2. That's pretty easy. Let's go to something a little bit more difficult, like reading. When you're reading at the speed that you are used to, are you actually deciphering? Or do you see the word and you've memorized what it is? That's why you could read at the speed that you're reading. Think about hundreds, thousands of words that you instantly recognize. Let me go even more complicated. How many of you have talked on the phone while you're driving? On hands-free, of course. And you get to where it is you're going. And then you look back and go, how the heck did I get here? You don't remember how you got there. Why? I mean, autopilot kicked in. And think about the complexity of driving. Just making a left turn on Queen Street is enough to scare us, right? And what you're doing is allowing that memory system, the limbic area, to drive your car. See how evolved the limbic area can be, just based on habit memory. Okay, finally, let's test our prefrontal area. This again, I'm going to put up an instruction, and I want you to do 2 things at the same time. Try to follow the instruction, and then try to note why you're failing at doing what I'm asking you to do. Good? Ready? Okay, so there's a couple of giggles. I guess it's because you read the word mother, and your limbic area immediately did what? A thought of your mother came in. But then the neocortex says, the instruction is don't think about your mother. So now you're forced to think about the Cookie Monster or something, just to get rid of your mother out of your mind. So what happens with the neocortex is that you engage it. You override the fast part of the brain, which is ultimately the reptilian and the limbic area. Only if you have self-control. Okay, so we learned something. And we know that all of the brain works together, that the reptilian part and the limbic part is the fast part of the brain, doesn't consume a lot of energy, versus the prefrontal area does take up a lot of energy, but it's there for us to solve complex problems and decisions that affect us in the future. So, it's interesting to say that the way the brain is structured perhaps is the reason why we haven't dealt with climate change. This is a piece of research that was done by 4 neuroscientists. And after you've sat through the fastest neuroscience lesson on Earth about a minute ago, I'm about to show you what they discovered, which is pretty astonishing. The first thing they did was take a volunteer. Okay, it wasn't a volunteer, it was a student, and they put him into an MRI machine. And what they did is ask them a simple question. How are you feeling now? Are you hungry? Are you cold? And that student or that volunteer basically said, no, I'm doing fine, I'm not hungry, I'm not cold. And they tracked the brain activity that was being generated by the MRI machine. All right, we see that right here, top white line, most dominant line in terms of score, and it indicates activity in those 2 areas, the limbic and the reptilian part of the brain. Then they asked this student a follow-up question. Where do you think of going for your summer holiday in June? Now that student is thinking, maybe I can go back to California or maybe to Europe to visit family. Now what's happening, the prefrontal area is doing what-if scenarios, simulations, and we track that activity with the green line or the second line. Third follow-up question was, now tell me, who is your best friend? I don't know, Joe. Okay, what do you think Joe is doing right now? Well, it's Saturday around 2:30. I don't know what Joe does, right? Again, you are thinking not about yourself this time, but about something happening in the present. And once again, we tracked the brain activity. Last question, where do you think Joe wants to go in June of next year for holidays? And once again, you had to use your prefrontal cortex in order to figure that out. Now, when you look at this, you can't walk away without concluding something pretty astonishing. This is how your brain works. Whether you're talking about a stranger now, or a friend now, or a friend later in the future, or yourself in the future, your brain processes the information the same way. In fact, what this says is that your brain sees you now as a different person than you in the future. So 50 years ago, when we had the heads up, do something about the planet, help it heal, what were we saying was act now, exercise self-control. And we didn't quite do that, did we? Because we were behaving the way every human does, taking care of today, relying on our limbic area mostly to make decisions, as opposed to exercising self-control, overriding our habits, and contributing to a healthier planet. So I didn't solve any problem here today about the climate change issue, but hopefully you've gotten some more insight as to how we got here. Thank you very much.